Well, today I'm very honored to be joined by Dave Paulides, and many of you know who Dave is. He has been working on the Missing 411 project for some years now. He's written multiple books, made several films about the missing persons phenomenon that's happening mainly in our national parks here in the United States. And this is certainly a great mystery. And I want to talk to him today about his research, about his films. And for those of you who probably don't know already, Dave is going to be joining me at the conference here in Bozeman, Montana, as one of the presenters, NephCon, which is taking place in June from the 27th through the 28th. Myself, my friend Gary Haven, Mike Adams, the health ranger, and Dave Paulides. So, and we may have a couple of other speakers coming online as well. So if you want to get tickets to that event, go to alberinoevents.com, alberinoevents.com, and grab your tickets today. Dave, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tim.
Dave, I've watched your films. I haven't read any of your books yet, but I've watched your films. I've listened to you on several interviews. And one thing that strikes me right away is that you clearly are a seasoned investigator. I love how you approach these investigations. You're very open-minded, and yet you know how to drill down and get to the most salient points as it pertains to this phenomenon. For those in my audience who are not familiar with your work, can you just kind of brief us, generally speaking, on what the missing 411 phenomenon is?
Sure. So I spent 20 years as a policeman in California, spent another 7, 8 years as an HR director in Silicon Valley at a master's degree in HR. And then I just decided to retire, raise my family, have a good life. And after that, I got some information involving what was happening in the wilderness and missing people, and called a couple policemen that I knew at the time and said, hey, are there many people missing in national parks? Because I had a couple national park rangers tell me. And they said that at the time, they worked these cases. At the end of 7 to 10 days, everything went quiet. Couple months later, they tried to get copies of the reports. They couldn't. And they said, Dave, you kind of have the background to look into this. Maybe you should. Well, when I called these other officers and I asked them if there's a lot of missing people in national parks, they said, wow, we didn't realize it, but yeah, there are. And that's kind of how the ball got rolling. And the first couple years, I just concentrated on national parks, but then the things started to move out into U.S. forests, BLM land, and eventually onto state parks and private land. When I started to do the work, I started to get reports in from various national parks, and I put the reports in my living room based upon what I wrote up as profile points, meaning strong indicators in the report about what happened and what was consistent report to report. The most common one that today even still stands, 95% of the reports have it, is that when they bring canines to the scene, bloodhounds, they can't pick up a scent trail. And as somebody who worked on the SWAT team for our city, and we had the canines on our team, that never happened. And for dogs not to pick up, a trained dog not to pick up a scent and follow it is unbelievable. And when I first started to see it, it didn't make any sense at all. But then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports came in like this that had their own pile of reports. And then I've eventually come up with several profile points, others being that at the point that someone goes missing, there's a weather event. It's either as the person is going missing or just as search and rescue starts. Another one is people most times are lost near water and are found near water. This thing called point of separation. Two hunters go out into the woods and they go hunting. And one of them, say, doesn't feel well, says, I'm going back to the car. Or it's as simple as, hey, you hunt that side of the mountain, I'll hunt this side. At that point of separation, something happens. It's almost as though someone, something, somewhere is watching and waiting for them to be alone, and one of them goes down. And that point of separation is consistent. Another one is that when the person is lost and they're eventually found, if they're found alive, the vast, vast majority of the time, they have no memory about what happened, how they got lost, or how they got found. That isn't normal either.
Hmm.
You bring professional trackers to the scene, and they might be able to track out 10, 15, 20, 25 feet, but then there's no more tracks. And another one is soon after a person goes missing, and I'm talking within 100 to 200 yards, so way before hypothermia could set in, they're missing clothing or shoes. And that's another fairly consistent one. And then as I started to accumulate hundreds of reports, I remembered back in my law enforcement days where I worked on task forces, we'd have a map of the city up. And on that map, we put pins in where all of the suspected crime was occurring that we were looking at, rapists, robbers, whoever. And I just thought, well, let's take these reports and let's take a map of the US and let's put spots up where these cases are occurring. And as they rolled out, cluster zones of missing people started to show up. Right now, there's 64 clusters of missing people in North America and Southern Canada. And the most predominant cluster zone anywhere in the world is Yosemite National Park. By an overwhelming margin, it's not even close. And so we have cluster zones, the profile points. My son said, Dad, he was in film school at the time. He says, Dad, we got to start doing videos and movies about this. You got something way valuable. And he directed my first movie. First movie was called Missing 411. Second one was called Missing 411, The Hunted. The most recent one was called Missing 411, The UFO Connection. You can watch them on Amazon. And each one of those movies represents a different element of Missing 411. Each one went to #1 in the world. Each one has about 10 million views. They've been widely accepted, and I'm greatly humbled that people watch them.
Well, they're excellent films. As I said, I've watched, I think there's 3 of them, correct? 3 films. And are you working on another film by any chance?
Not right now, but it's in the works. I'm writing the storyline for it.
Well, they're very, very well done, and you can see the progression. The production gets even better as you go. And the third one, the UFO Connection, is extremely well produced. Very, very, because I'm also in film production, and that very, very good films, especially that third film. How many people would you say go missing every year that you would categorize in this particular phenomenon in the United States?
It's very difficult to tell because, let's say, the National Park Service, early on, we asked them for a list of all the missing people within their system. They came back and told me that they didn't have any of those lists. And George Knapp, who's the chief investigative correspondent for CBS in Las Vegas, who's a friend, looked into it and he said, Dave, that's impossible. They have a list. They don't want you to have the list.
Mm-hmm.
They have lists of inventory in national parks. They have lists of how many movies have been made in their national parks. But to say that they don't have lists of missing people, that's obscene. The U.S. Forest Service says the same thing. Bureau of Land Management says the same thing. So it's really hard to get a grip on it when you don't know the numbers and the government or governmental agencies aren't helping. There's a general number put out by the FBI every year about people who disappear. That number is highly misused. They say, I think 650,000 people a year go missing. But the reality behind that is that, say you have a teenage son or teenage daughter that runs away. You call the police or file a report. That's one missing person case. They come back 3 days later. That still stands as one missing person case on the record. That person, your son or daughter, runs away 3 times a year. That's 3 cases, even though they come back.
Mm-hmm.
So really, it's a very small percentage of 1% that qualifies in the highly unusual part of this.
So we're talking at least hundreds of people go missing every year, correct?
Yes.
And mostly in the national parks, is that correct?
I would say not. I would say there's probably an equal percentage spread out amongst state parks, national parks, U.S. forests, BLM, and private property.
Okay, so wilderness areas. We're talking mainly wilderness areas.
Yeah.
Okay. It is very interesting to me because I live right on the border of Yellowstone. I live in Montana, and we have Glacier up by where you live, up there, Glacier National Park, and I'm down here by Yellowstone. I spent a lot of time in Yellowstone National Park, and I'm ever since I've started watching your content. Every time I go to Yellowstone Park with my family, I'm a little bit nervous because I've got kids, and I keep an eagle's eye on my kids when I'm in these national parks now, because it's really, I mean, I can't think of anything more frightening than having, say, my 4-year-old walking behind me and turning around and suddenly he's gone. Because this is some of the cases that you've talked about. People literally, because I think most people might assume that, well, these individuals, they go off hiking in the woods and then they disappear, which is sometimes the case. But also you've documented cases where you'll have family members who are there one moment, the parents turn around or the friends turn around and they're gone. So it's not just like people getting lost hiking and hunting. This phenomenon is exceedingly strange, and it's unnerving. It's very, very unnerving. Now, what something I wondered, and you already kind of answered this question as I was watching your films, is when people come back, in the very few cases where people are found, and I wanted to ask you if they in fact had any memory of what happened to them, and the fact that they don't is very intriguing to me, because this implies something that is beyond just getting lost in the woods. I mean, I've been lost in the Amazon jungle, so and I remember every second of it. It's a very visceral, frightening scenario, and those memories have stayed with me forever. I mean, my entire life. And for something extraordinary to happen where you're missing for a period of time, you come back and you have no memory of what transpired. That right away is an indication that something obviously unusual has happened. What do you make of that?
So I like to say that I'm a mile wide and inch deep. My background, not only in law enforcement, but I always had an interest in the UFO sector. And I decided about 15 years ago that I'd go out and become an investigator for MUFON. So I had an inside look at hundreds of their reports on abductees and missing people. And I also did some work on writing books about Bigfoot, and I did that for a technology, one of the owners of a big technology company, 2 of them. So I didn't have great interest in those topics to begin with, but that gave me the background to kind of look at all these independently and keep an open mind. And one thing when you start looking at UFO abductees, the one commonality is that the vast majority of them don't remember everything that happened to them. In fact, many of them don't remember anything. And there's missing time. And these people that disappear in the woods have missing time. The people that claim that they were abducted oftentimes are missing clothes. People that go into the woods and come back are oftentimes missing clothes and missing shoes. And lastly, there's extreme psychological impact on the person both ways. And I suppose it wasn't until the last movie that I really started to look harder at that UFO multi-dimension portal possibility when I started to talk to theoretical physicists about what may be happening.
I definitely want to dive into the content of your last film. There's some things that are very add to the mystery, are very bizarre about these missing person cases. Some of them, you mentioned in your films that the areas where people go missing seem to be devoid of wildlife. That's really strange. And that could be an indication that obviously something happened and it frightened the wildlife away. Something very odd happened. And then you also talk about how in at least one case in your films, the FBI, you learn that the FBI has been monitoring anomalous missing person cases. What do you think the FBI is monitoring some of these for? Because that's unusual, right? For the FBI to be involved in some of these cases.
So for children under 2 years old, there's a special segment in FBI protocol that says that they can look into those cases. Children above 2 years old and adults, they don't look into missing persons cases, supposedly. That's not part of what their policies state. Now, young children who vanish in the woods, yeah, they've got the leeway to go and look at that. But there's been FBI interest in this for decades. And in my movies, I interviewed a 25-year FBI veteran, John D'Souza, and John explained how he was assigned to go look into these anomalous things. And he said on camera, he said, Dave, multi-dimensions, portals, they're all real. And people have gone missing and we know about it. And he goes, I put it in my reports. I've talked to FBI leaders about it. And my question to him was, well, what's the response when you talk to them? They don't want to know. They go, write it down. We don't want to hear about it. We don't want to talk about it. Leave it alone. And he said he wasn't thwarted in any investigations to look into it, but administrators and other federal agencies, they don't want to know.
Hey guys, I know you hear me talk about this a lot, but I have a phenomenal members community called the Alberino Analysis. There's thousands of people in my community, and we have just a great time interfacing through our own social media platform. It's like our own private Facebook wall. We talk about very, very deep and controversial theological topics over there. Of course, we talk all things UFOs and aliens and everything that's rolling out right now in regard to disclosure. We're constantly conversing about these topics. We talk about megaliths and ancient civilizations, and the people in my community are so intelligent. And aside from all that, I'm publishing a lot of content over there. I'm doing private briefings that you won't see anywhere else. There are films over there that I've produced with my friend Gary Haven that you will not see anywhere else. And these films are TV level production, okay? And they cover some amazing content like the elongated skulls. Hey, we did a genetic test on some of these skulls, and the results were quite amazing, and you won't be able to see that information anywhere else except for over there. We discover a lost city in the Andes Mountains called Tauripunku that is, again, not featured anywhere else. So if you want to interact with me, there's a DM feature. You can direct message me in my community. I try and interact with everybody. You can ask me questions. We do these live stream book club sessions. Right now, we're going through the book Cydonia, The Secret Chronicles of Mars by David Flynn. And we're privileged to have David's twin brother, Mark, in the community and his daughter, Tycee. And they're going through the content of the book with us. And this information is so important, so relevant to the times in which we live. If you join my community, you're also going to get the first shot at tickets for any events I do. And there's a bunch of other features in there. All of the conference material that I have from previous conferences is posted in there for annual subscribers. There's just so much content. I mean, there is literally hundreds of hours of additional content. So if you've been looking for a community, a troll-free community where you can express your thoughts on a wide variety of topics without the vitriol, without the toxicity, an environment in which you can grow and learn with others and make lifelong friendships with people who not only want to talk about these things, but can discuss them in an intelligent way with open minds, then come join us at the Alberino Analysis members community. You won't regret it. To become a member, go to the alberinoanalysis.com or click on the link in the description of this video. You mentioned getting into the UFO connection content. I think if I recall, the first story you featured is from Ray Selman. This was a 65-year-old gentleman. He went missing in 2013 while camping around Harrison Lake in Vancouver. And you mentioned that in this particular case, the RCMP SWAT team was deployed to look for him. And these guys were heavily armed. when they went out to look for him. And then we learned that they were actually withholding information from his wife. And they never gave him his belongings, for example, his backpack, which was discovered. And that was a very bizarre case because Ray had a couple of firearms with him, and they found one of his guns over by the lake, and then they found a handgun like 400 yards into this field or on top of this hill, I think. And I thought that was very interesting that they would deploy a heavily armed SWAT team as a kind of a first response. That struck me as very strange, almost as if somebody suspected that something very specific happened, that they would deploy this team. Isn't that strange in these cases, that they would deploy armed people who are heavily armed like that?
So there was one of the search and rescue leaders of that area of British Columbia was there on scene that we interviewed. And he says, Dave, out of the hundreds of searches I've been on, I've never seen anything like this. And he said that the RCMP came out of the bush and said, don't go in there. There's nothing to search. It's too thick. It's too wild. He said, Dave, nothing's too thick or too wild to search. Why did they keep us out? And Ray was fastidious about his guns. To own a pistol in British Columbia, it's not an easy thing. It's not like in Montana where you just go down to the store and buy it. In British Columbia, you got to go through 3 or 4 hoops. You got to get special licenses. To get a rifle is a lot easier, as a matter of fact. Get a pistol, no. Ray had all the right licenses. And his wife said nobody was more fastidious about taking care of his guns than Ray. And way up on top of a mountaintop from where he was camping, searchers found his pistol, which was an amazing find that they found that. And then down below where he went missing, they searched the lakeside, and part of the lakeside, they found his folded clothes. And I've talked about this in other cases years before, where when people disappear, you find folded clothes. It makes no sense. The RCMP said, well, he must be in the water. So his wife went out and hired the best search and rescue water recovery team in North America, this husband and wife. We went out with them. And they have the best side scan sonar in the world. And when I interviewed him, he looked right in my face. He goes, Dave, he's not in the water. I go, where is he? I don't know, but he's not in the water. He's not there. So where is Ray? Ray had gone there probably 20 times during his life. It's a beautiful spot. Something weird happened there. Really weird.
The folded clothes thing, how often does that come up? Not just where is that the only case where you've discovered the clothes, not just discovered the clothes, but folded?
Now, there's probably been 10 of those I found in maybe 2,000 cases.
Yeah, that's really curious to me. Like, who would take the time to fold their clothes in the midst of being abducted or getting lost or something like that? It makes absolutely no sense to me. Even if Ray, in this case, were going for a swim in that lake, very few people are going to take the time to fold their clothes. They're just going to disrobe and jump in the lake. So you discuss in the UFO Connection film, not only do people go missing, but there's actually been cases in which individuals have witnessed animals being taken by craft. Specifically, there was a case in Washington in which a group of Hispanic guys witnessed a UFO. It didn't necessarily abduct this elk, as far as I understand from the film. It lifted the elk up into the air, and it was sort of transporting the elk under the craft. Is that correct? And it took the elk into the woods. They even mentioned that it bumped into a tree, this craft, as it was transporting this elk. And this was a small craft. I think the dimensions were something like 5 by 8 feet.
So what happened was Weyerhaeuser property just west of Mount St. Helens. Weyerhaeuser owns hundreds of thousands of acres out there. And they had a crew that was replanting a hillside after they had logged it. And there were about 15 men out there. And they watched this craft, just like you said, very small, come in, start to hover over a herd of elk. Elk dispersed, except one just stayed stationary. They said it looked odd the way it didn't move. So somehow it probably froze that elk. Craft comes down within a couple feet. Nothing from the craft lowers itself to the elk. It's just somehow grabs that elk and starts transporting it away. And they said it didn't make sense that that size of a craft could pick up a 400 or 500 pound elk, but it took it away. And that was not the first time that strangeness has happened around elk, but this turned into a MUFON case because the manager of the Weyerhaeuser facility called MUFON and asked them to come out and investigate it. They all came out and they investigated it. They had bilingual investigators, spoke to each one of the tree planters. And the investigator said, well, Dave, one of the more interesting things for your work is one of the first questions or statements from these people was they were worried that the craft was going to come back for them.
Yeah. Well, this seems to be, maybe there's an association here with cattle mutilation. I don't know if you've come across that in relation to this phenomenon, but how does this potentially tie into the wasting disease? You talk about the wasting disease in the film, and wasting disease it's actually quite a frightening thing that's happening to deer and elk in the United States. For most people, I think, are familiar with this, but those who aren't, it basically turns these animals into zombies, and they literally waste away until they die. And many hunters are encountering this, and it's a real concern because the problem is that the thing that people are really concerned about is it jumping to humans. And obviously you're looking at like a zombie apocalypse if wasting disease jumps to humans. What are the potential connections there in your mind?
So to explain chronic wasting disease it's exactly the same essentially as mad cow disease in Europe was decades ago. And the people in Europe said, oh, it'll never cross over to humans. It did cross to humans and it killed hundreds. And it's a prion-based disease. It's very unusual. We have it in Montana really bad because it's coming down from Alberta on the north, and it's coming up from the south in Wyoming. It first escaped from a facility in Fort Collins, Colorado, at the University of Colorado, where they were testing it. And essentially, it infects all cervids. And when a cervid becomes infected, it shows no symptoms for 2 years. Yet, as it's infected, it's spreading the prions through urine, through saliva, etc. So let's just say that a deer urinates on some brush. Well, that prion stays on that brush even though it rains. Next cervid comes by, moose, elk, whatever, deer, and eats that, it's going to catch it. There's only a very small percentage of these cervids that have some genetic resistance to it. It's a very small number. And in Wyoming, it's the worst. Every county in Wyoming has this. It's spread to over 28 states. And Washington didn't admit this at the time. The state didn't. But the Weyerhaeuser manager did, that when that elk was taken, that Washington State Fish and Game had told them months earlier that they had CWD in that area, but Washington State won't admit it. Now, it's unusual that elk was taken in front of those guys right after that Weyerhaeuser employee was told about the chronic wasting disease. And that, like you said, they have stated over and over that it won't cross to humans, except every fish and game website in the US says, do not eat an animal that has chronic wasting disease. Now, if you're a hunter, you go out and you shoot one of these, every state will test the animal to make sure it doesn't have it. But the reality of it is that if you get it, the onset is almost 20 years. It won't show any symptoms. Then the symptoms that it shows is identical to dementia or Alzheimer's. And once you get Alzheimer's or dementia, your doctor is going to take care of you for a year or two until you die. Once you die, they're just going to sign off. There's not going to be any autopsy. That's going to be the end of it because they saw you get Alzheimer's or dementia. But the best scientists are saying now that a lot of people have caught chronic wasting disease and it's being
Wow.
misdiagnosed.
Well, that's bad news.
Yeah,
So they believe it's already crossed over.
some do. And in fact,
Wow.
there were articles just within the last 2 months about this specifically.
And so as far as we know now, it's passed only from, let's say, if a hunter eats an animal that has wasting disease. But the problem is, if it crosses over into humans, then it's assumedly it will be passed among humans in the same way it's passed among cervids. In other words, through saliva and bodily fluids, which is a real concern. I mean, I live in Montana, and I've been sort of tracking this. I don't think people realize how big of a deal it is if in fact it's crossed over, because we have no idea. We have no, as far as I know, we have no remedies. We have no vaccination or anything like that against wasting disease. And maybe I think perhaps we can insinuate that somebody's monitoring. When I say somebody, referring to this case where they picked up the elk, where the craft lifts the elk up into the air and transports it somewhere. Maybe they're monitoring this situation. I think you guys insinuate that in the film as well. Maybe maybe these entities are monitoring this situation with wasting disease, because they're apparently very interested in harvesting elk and deer, at least. And who knows what they're doing with that elk and deer? What do you think that they're doing with the elk and deer?
Well, later on in the movie, we highlight a hunter in Wyoming that was hunting in the Medicine Bow National Forest. And he lined up on some animals, fired around. He said, Dave, it was like slow motion. The bullet came out of the gun, stopped in midair, hit something, and fell to the ground. And he goes, I couldn't know what to think of that. He says he went over, picked up the round, put it in his pocket. And then this alien entity walked over to him and throws him this package and tells him in mind speak to take the package. And he goes, I don't know why I did, but I did. And he said, the next thing I know, I'm on this craft getting flown away with the deer that I was lined up to shoot. And he said, on the craft, they took me somewhere. He goes, I don't know where. And they had me walk behind this metallic thing. And after that, this entity tells him, we don't need you. We're sending you back. And I said, well, what did that mean if they needed you? You weren't coming back? And he kind of giggled and he goes, I guess. And I said, well, why don't you think that they needed you? And he said, well, I can't have kids. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, well, I've had the operation. I can't have kids. I've had a vasectomy. And I said, it's pretty interesting. And they sent him back and he was missing. They were looking for him, just like all the cases I talk about. And then he's found. And when Carl went missing, he had lung scarring from tuberculosis. And he was seeing a doctor. Well, he comes back. They put him in a hospital because he'd been gone so long. They just wanted to work him up. And they said, his doctor went over and looked at the x-rays and said, Carl, you don't have any lung scarring anymore. It's gone. And the only thing they could make of it is that something happened on that craft, that they cleaned him up. He lived to be 93 years old. About a year after I filmed that segment, Carl died. But his story is amazing.
It's kind of comical too, because this entity he encounters, who's described in a very bizarre way. He says that the being, he drew a picture, and you show this in the film. He drew a picture of the being, and apparently the being had one hand like a cone. I mean, it would seem to be a humanoid, one hand like a cone, and then no hand on the other side. His hair was described as being like straw. Obviously, the communication was telepathic between them, and it was either inferred or it was told to him directly, to Carl, that they were wearing these. It's described. Carl's wife describes it as like a black scuba suit, and it was told to Carl that our sun burns their skin. They're very sensitive to our sun, and so they have to wear these protective suits. And what's funny to me is, and if I recall, I think you say in the film that these 4 pills are floated to him, and he's asked, "Are you hungry?" First, right? He says the being asks Carl, "Are you hungry?" And Carl says, "Yeah." And so he floats these pills over to him, and Carl swallows one, which I find to be very strange, because if I encounter a being with a cone hand and straw hair in this very strange setting, and by the way, Carl encountered, you have some graphics about this. Carl encountered like a cube out there, some sort of a cube, and I wasn't clear if that cube was encompassing the elk that he wanted to shoot at, or if the cube was the craft. But he encountered this cube, and it was like transparent. And he swallows one of these pills, which again I find quite comical that he would even do this. I certainly would not swallow a pill that was floated over to me from a being with straw hair and a cone hand. And then the next thing he knows after he swallows this pill is he's on this craft, and there's those elk that he was aiming his gun at. The elk are on the craft with him, and his response, the first thing he says to this being on this craft is, "You got my elk." I mean, it's a very comical situation to me, because that's not the first thing I would say. Hey, you got my elk. I was going to take one of those elk. The alien said to him that his name was Auzo or Uzo, something like that.
Right.
And then he informed Carl that sometimes, from time to time, they come down to harvest elk and deer. And they also go over to the ocean to get fish and take it back. And then, as you said, this craft takes Carl and the elk, their cargo, takes them somewhere. And it's implied through Carl's testimony that it's off the planet, because Carl looks out the window and he can see a little blue ball, right? And he thinks that he was looking at planet Earth. This is definitely one of the most bizarre cases I've ever heard. I mean, not just even in regard to missing people, but just, I'm a ufologist, and this is one of the most bizarre cases I've ever heard in ufology. And just his responses as all of this is happening are very comical to me. And as you say, they were apparently interested in his reproductive capability. So maybe some of these people who are going missing are specifically selected, and obviously they're being taken from an environment where there's not a whole lot of people around. It would make sense to take these people from national parks or wilderness areas, because there's not a whole lot of people around. I mean, it makes sense that these people are disappearing, a lot of them while they're hunting. And in those cases, a lot of these guys are totally by themselves. So at this point in time, after all the cases you've investigated, would you say this is at this point the most plausible explanation that people are being taken, that this is somehow related to the UFO phenomenon, specifically the abduction phenomenon?
Let me throw a little spin into this that even makes it more complicated. So in the research we've done, we found that there was a group of physicists that have disappeared over the years, in the last 50 years. And when you start to look at those physicists, there's one commonality. They're all German. There's not one physicist that's missing anywhere in the world that isn't German. Carl is German. All of the hunters missing in the Medicine Bow National Forest in the last 25 years are German. And I don't think that can be happenstance. And one of the things that I've talked about over the years is there seem to be more people with German heritage that have gone missing than any other heritage. And what is that about? And Carl was returned, like you said, because he didn't have the reproductive ability, but Carl was German. And I don't know what to make of that, except I just present the facts. And it's overwhelming that there's this German connection.
Do you think that these missing cases that may have something to do with UFOs, like obviously in Carl's case, it certainly does, a non-human presence. Having worked with MUFON, you're very much, I'm sure, aware of the typical alien abduction scenario, mostly involving gray aliens. Do you think we're looking at a similar phenomenon here? Because obviously the guy that this being that Carl encountered was not a gray alien, something else. Do you think this is is this different than the typical alien abduction scenario, or do you think it's related?
See, I think what Carl encountered was something robotic, very advanced robotics, but a robotic type entity. And in talking to the MUFON people that have seen the film, they said, Dave, think outside the box. Let's say the grays are the ones that are taking people, and they're very advanced. Well, maybe they don't want the finger pointed at them anymore. They use one of their robots to go do the front end work.
Well, there are many similarities here, and there are differences as well. The fact that the clothes are removed, obviously, that's almost universal. I would say universal in gray alien abduction cases. But in the case of gray aliens, the abductees are almost always brought back. That would be a major distinction here, whereas most of these people never come back. And even if you boil down the cases that you've investigated, and we can maybe weed out some of the cases where the individuals, their remains are eventually found, you still have this percentage of individuals who are never found. And it should be noted that the searches that are organized, at least in all of the cases I've seen that you've investigated, are massive. They're not just like you just don't have a couple of guys out there with dogs for a day or two. You have massive searches involving, in some cases, hundreds of people and teams of dogs and helicopters. And they're looking for these individuals for weeks sometimes. And then in some cases, the very area that they've spent a lot of time in and they didn't find any evidence, suddenly the remains of this person show up in this spot as if the individual's taken, something happened for an extended period of time, and then the person is brought back but not alive. The remains are deposited. And that to me is indicative of the idea that whoever this group is, let's say it's some sort of a non-human faction that's related to the UFO phenomenon, they want it to appear, at the very least, like something natural happened. Like this is explainable. They're covering their tracks, in other words. They put the remains back so that we would have the idea that, oh, we just missed it. We just overlooked this area, or we missed it when we covered this area. So there seems to be like almost like as I said, an attempt to make this appear mundane.
Well, let me throw another spin at you. In a high percentage of these cases, if the person is found deceased, they can't determine the cause of death. And that is not normal. My son was playing ice hockey on the East Coast, and actually they made it to the Final Four. And a physician coroner for the biggest jurisdiction on the U.S. East Coast called me and said, Dave, I know you're going to be in this town. I'll drive 100 miles and meet you. I want to talk to you. I said, okay. And this jurisdiction is huge. This person had a lot of authority. So before the game, we meet at the hotel, and she sits down and she tells me the story. Part of the missing 411 investigations also has to do with people who disappear near water, are found in water, deceased. Nobody ever sees them go in the water, and they're later found, and they can't determine the cause of death. Well, she investigated, she said, over 50 cases in her jurisdiction of people just like this. And she said, Dave, everybody, all of the physicians and myself in my office sit around once a month and review cases. We've reviewed these cases so many times, it's ridiculous. And you are onto something big. We've known about it. Nobody talks about it. We are scientists. We will get to the bottom of a death. And when we can't, something's really wrong. These people did not drown, Dave. Something else is happening. And I wrote a book called Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence. And it deals with predominantly people between 20 and 30, predominantly males, that have disappeared, sometimes right in the middle of a town. And they're found in a river days, weeks later, floating along, and they're pulled out. Coroner goes through normal process, can't determine the cause of death. Sometimes the amount of time they're in the water doesn't match the amount of time they're missing. And that's, something's really odd there. A lot of people say, oh, well, maybe they're held by terrorists or something. No, there's no injuries to the body. They're not tortured. They're just gone and no cause of death. Now, I've had some people, some claim to be psychics, say, well, Dave, they were stolen for their soul, and their soul was taken, and that's why you can't figure out the cause of death.
That's very intriguing to me. Yeah. Yeah, going back to the abduction material, it's been reported by some abductees, and Carla Turner writes about this, and I believe Dr. David Jacobs writes something about this as well. He mentions it, I believe, but Turner for sure talks about how some of the abductees report a procedure that happens to them while they're on the craft, and I don't know if you ever heard about this, Dave, but there's a black box involved. And the black box is usually positioned above their heads as they're laying on the table. And the way that the abductees describe it is that their soul gets sucked into this black box. And while the grays are doing something to their bodies. And some abductees claim to have the soul being held in this black box container and a new body being brought in like a clone, and then the soul going back into the clone. And this has come up quite a few times, this black box in the abduction material. I don't know if you've encountered it, but I heard you say that in an interview, and that I found that to be very intriguing. Maybe there is something about this whole phenomena that has to do with human soul that these entities are interested in. Of course, this is just rank speculation. Who knows? But one thing that you mentioned in an interview that I thought was very pertinent to all of this is the fact that at least in a couple of cases, or at least in one case, the family decided to do their own autopsy and to have their own toxicology tests done, and they discovered that the deceased individual had high levels of GHB in their blood, which is not something that is normally looked for. If I understand this correctly, you have to do a special test to try and detect this. And this, for people who don't know, this is the date rape drug. And so this is the drug that it's a roofie. You slip a roofie to somebody and they become incapacitated for a period of time. And how many cases are you aware of where the deceased person had high levels of GHB?
So when a coroner does an autopsy and they do a chemical analysis of the blood and urine, there's 24 different drugs and narcotics that they test for. There's probably 100 that they should test for, but they only do 24. And GHB is not on that list anywhere in the nation. Going back to this meeting I had with this coroner on the East Coast, she tried to get me onto a speaker's list at a coroner's conference to specifically talk about this GHB issue, because she thought that every chemical analysis should have GHB on it. Now, the body produces GHB in minute quantities. And in talking to some of these people, they said, well, maybe somehow some entity has learned to turn on that spigot So it really produces a lot of it quickly. And essentially what GHB will do is you're aware of what's happening, but you can't respond to it. You're essentially paralyzed. So you put somebody like that in a river, and if they're going to determine the cause of death, it's going to be drowning. But because GHB comes out of your system so quickly, chances are they're not even going to find it. Now, because a standard autopsy doesn't look for GHB, all the thousands of autopsies done, there's not going to find it. It's only going to be that minute few where the families get upset and they say, we're going to pay for our own. And they found this GHB in large quantities in the body. And there hasn't been a lot. There's probably been 5 or 10 that I only know about in the last 20 years.
Well, yeah. And as you said, they don't really test for it. So who knows? Maybe all of them could have this particular marker. And this would, as you're saying, this would be very, very important to be routinely testing for this, especially in these missing person cases. And something that this is a similarity here between gray alien abductions, because when the grays show up, usually before they show up, and they normally come in groups of 3, before they show up, the abductee is incapacitated before they arrive, or is shortly incapacitated thereafter, after they arrive. So incapacitated, like sedated. But it's interesting because very much like the GHB, you still have awareness of what's happening. If you're sedated with GHB, this is what makes it so horrible. People, go through this. You're in this sedated, incapacitated condition where you can't move your body. It's kind of like, this is why it's oftentimes associated with sleep paralysis, because your mind is fully aware, or at least somewhat aware of what's happening, but your body will not respond. You can't move. You're totally incapacitated. And because I know this is the case with abductees, it seems there's another similarity here, apparently, with these missing people, that they are incapacitated, probably like the elk, before they're taken, just frozen, totally incapacitated, and then they're removed from the environment. And the other thing that people need to understand is another very important connection here, and I'm not insinuating that that the missing people phenomenon is the same as gray alien abduction. I'm just drawing correlations here. There's interesting corollaries. And in the case of abductees, you can have, for example, a group of people, and this is one of the cases I think that was highlighted by Carla Turner, the late Dr. Carla Turner. You can have a group of people who are renting a cabin together, an Airbnb, and they're all just sort of having a good time. You can have, a large group of people, and then suddenly everybody is switched off. Everybody just sort of is frozen. And the Greys switch them off somehow, and they come and they abduct one person from that group. They take that one person, they do all of the typical abduction procedures on the craft, and while that person is on the craft, going through the typical abduction procedures for who knows how long, and I think, by the way, there's time dilation happening. The time on the craft is longer than we would perceive it from outside of the craft. But when that person is returned to that environment, everybody is switched on. And the commonality is that everybody has missing time, but it's seamless. The moment at which they're switched off, so to speak, incapacitated, and the moment at which they're switched back on is seamless. They have no memory of the abductee being taken or anything that happened in the interim. And this is also, as I said, an interesting corollary here, because you have cases, which are the most disturbing to me, where you have people taken, and they're in the environment, in these national parks, or wherever they happen to be, in the missing persons cases, where one moment they're there, the next moment they're gone. And in those cases, do these individuals, let's say it's maybe a mother or father, and their child is gone, suddenly just disappears. Do the other witnesses, have they ever reported missing time?
No. Let's back up for a second. Let's talk about Carl, who was taken by the craft, returned. When Carl was returned, he says his first recollection is falling through the air, hitting the hillside, and rolling down the hillside and injuring his shoulder. Key point. Now, Carl was awake the moment he left the craft, apparently, and is falling through the air. One thing I've noted in a lot of research is that there's many, hundreds of people that have disappeared in the wilderness and have died by way of fall and died by way of hypothermia. Let's go back to your point about GHB. If you were loaded up with GHB and they were returning you and they put you on the ground in the middle of winter out here in Montana, what are you going to die from if you don't come out of that GHB quickly? Hypothermia.
You're going to freeze to death.
And no one will ever test for the GHB. So cause of death is hypothermia. And when you start to look at all of these parallel things happening, American Express did an ad about 2 years ago. A guy was in a bar and he was dancing and having fun. And all of a sudden, everybody around him freezes. And he walks out of the bar. To your point exactly, I was thinking, wow, the producers of that ad probably know the UFO segment real well, because that's exactly what kind of happens. And in the instances where all of these cases I wrote about in the book, nobody sees the person leave the bar or the restaurant. They just are suddenly in the middle of the river. There was one instance where a young man was at a bar. This was in Wisconsin. And he all of a sudden wakes up in an icy river floating downstream. And he works his way, as the river's flowing, he works his way to a bank in the river. And I swear to you, this is the truth. It's the bank next to a hospital. And he runs into the hospital for medical treatment for hypothermia, and he lives, and he talks about it. And I write about it. He doesn't know how he ended up in the river. He doesn't know how long he's been in the river. But if somebody's putting you in that river, it's not for anything good. It's so you'll die.
It's to kill you. Yeah. And if you're dropped in a body of water with this GHB in your system, you're going to drown because you can't move.
Yeah.
And that seems to be, to me at least, what's happened in many of these cases. They were brought back, and it appears, as we were saying earlier, it appears to me that whoever brought them back wanted it to appear that they died of natural causes. In other words, they drown. And if you want to assure that the person drowns, well, you drop them in the body of water while they're incapacitated. And there's nothing they can do about it. And of course, we pick them up. And as you said, it's obviously they died of hypothermia or drowning and or just dropping them off in the middle of Montana in the winter. They're dead. I mean, they're dead. Not only even if they're not incapacitated, if they're in the wilderness, they're probably going to die anyway before they can get help. So there's a very nefarious element to all of this. Whatever they're doing with these people, the ones that don't come back, who knows what happens to them ultimately, but the ones that do come back, obviously they get what they want from them, and then they bring them back and they make sure they're dead, or at least they attempt to make sure they're dead so that it appears like something natural happened. So this is very nefarious, and I can't help but, I'm not sure if you're aware of last year I went and did an investigation in the Amazon, and it had to do with the so-called face peelers. And there was a phenomenon that was happening in the Peruvian Amazon specifically, regarding individuals that were being abducted, in some cases, or attempted abductions, and these abductions were much more visceral and human, but they involved advanced technology, and these people were apparently their faces were being cut off. They were being harvested for something to do with their faces, and that's why in the Amazon it's known as the face peelers, the pelacaras. And as I was watching your films, I couldn't help but feel like there's something similar going on, although there's a lot of differences between these two phenomenons. But in the case of the Peruvian usually indigenous communities in the Amazon, these people would go missing. And this is not something that was just happening last year. This is something it's been a legend in the Amazon since the 80s. And it begins in the 80s, like the mid 80s, and it doesn't go further back than the mid 80s. It begins in the mid 80s. And sometimes these people are discovered later on. Sometimes they're never found. So it does kind of feel like the missing persons thing. Sometimes they're never found, but oftentimes their bodies are discovered later on, and they're missing organs, or their face is gone, or half of their face is gone. And apparently somebody is harvesting something to do with the face, maybe glands, and in some cases organs in the Amazon. And it's associated with advanced technology. So lights in the sky, somebody will see a craft, or they'll see, in the case of what was happening last year, they'll see individuals making incursions into the village, riding on these circular hoverboards. And they would come 2 by 2, and they were dressed in black-bodied armor suits, and they would arrive into the village, land their hoverboards in the jungle, and then they would either walk, or in some cases they were described as floating into the village. And apparently what they were doing was they were looking to abduct people, to engage in this very nefarious practice. And in one case, this young lady who I interviewed named Talia, there was an attempted abduction of Talia, but she survived. And when they abducted her, they arrived, she was in her backyard picking fruit out of the tree. They always come right after dark. And the fruit fell from the tree, and she reached over to pick it up, and she felt this gentle breeze hit her, and she looks over to see what was causing this wind. And it was this guy totally covered in a black armored bodysuit with a mask on, and the mask had almond-shaped eye lenses. And the guy was like surfing on a hoverboard, on the circular hoverboard, and he lands right behind her, grabs her from behind, covers her mouth so she can't scream. And then another guy comes up, same situation, on a hoverboard, lands in front of her, grabs her legs, and then they transport her behind this chicken coop in the backyard. And they proceed. The first thing they do is they take a syringe, and it has some kind of a sedative in it, and they shoot it up her nose. And she starts to become semi-sedated, but she's aware of what's happening. And ultimately, without going through all the details, they put some cream on her face, and then they take out what I think is a laser scalpel, and they start to make an incision under her jawline on her neck. And she's freaking out. She starts to sort of realize that what's going on, and she starts to push one of the masks up. She gets her hand loose and starts to push the mask up of the guy that's holding her from behind. And the guy in front of her slaps her in the face, and they momentarily lost control of her. And she was, in that moment, is able to scream. She screams at the top of her lungs, and the villagers, who are already aware, and they're in a state of high vigilance, they're already aware of these strange intruders that have been making incursions into their village for the last, couple of weeks. They all come running. A group of villagers come running with flashlights, and they see these guys. And I interviewed these people. They see these guys floating on their hoverboards, maneuvering between the trees. They realize the jig's up, and they shoot up into the air on their hoverboards. And Talia is left laying there, bloodied up, and she's out of it. She's totally sedated. And they're able to bring her down to a clinic in another village. And she was extremely traumatized. So as I'm watching your films, I can't help but wonder if something, now that seemed very human to me, although there was some advanced technology involved. They saw these acorn-shaped craft, but not an acorn like a vertical acorn, instead like a horizontal one laying on its side. So imagine an acorn laying on its side. That's what the craft looked like, and the craft was silent. And in some cases, they saw it just 40 feet above them. And so there was advanced technology involved, what I would describe as advanced aerospace technology involved in this face peelers phenomenon. And it again, as I'm watching your films, I can't help but wonder Is there something going on here that's similar to the face peeler phenomenon, where somebody is harvesting something from these people? And we mentioned the vasectomy of Carl. Maybe that's why he was not useful to them. In that case, maybe they were looking for genetics. But have you ever heard of anything like that in the United States in all of your investigations? Anything that's reminiscent of what I just described with this face peeler phenomenon?
Never. And I've read a ton of abduction reports out of South America. To me, it seems as though what happens in South America is much more violent to the victims on even the grand scale compared to what happens in the United States and Canada. Quite different. I don't know of any cases that we've worked that even bring in anything close to that. One last thing I wanted to tell you is that when I was in Canada and we were investigating the salmon case, we had a RCMP that we interviewed about the incident. And what I learned, I didn't even know this from being with MUFON, is that when the RCMP takes a report of somebody seeing a UFO, that's one categorization. Somebody sees an entity, that's another. Attempted abduction is another. If the RCMP comes out and you're a neighbor and you see a craft in the sky, they will come out, they will take a report. And by protocol, that has to get a top secret notification, and it's sent overnight to Ottawa. The RCMP and the Canadian government take UFOs, entities, and abductions so much more seriously than the United States. It's ridiculous. I never knew that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Are you at this point, would you say that, and I kind of asked you this question before, but I want to drill down on this a little bit more. Are you at this point fairly convinced that at least some of these cases are non-human origin?
So going back to the best evidence we have of this happening, in Carl's case, it's one of the few incidents where there was any evidence at all. So you had the tuberculosis coming off Carl. His blood work that was taken was perfect. The bullet he had in his pocket was analyzed, and they could not determine what that bullet could have hit to make it take the configuration that it did. Carl took a polygraph. I mean, all these things go to show that something super unusual happened with Carl. And there's an equal number of people over here that say, Dave, really, I think this is our government or a terrestrial-based government from somewhere doing this to us. And we're that ant farm that we used to have as kids. Mm-hmm. And when they need something, if it's DNA, if it's blood or whatever it is, they kind of look in the ant farm and say, okay, let's go to South America or let's go to North America and get what we need.
Yeah, and then they cover their tracks and try and make it look like it was just, that the person died of drowning or whatever after they're done with them. In going back to Carl's case, there's another element that I think we should consider as well. In gray alien abductions, a common factor is what Carla Turner described as virtual reality scenarios, that apparently these entities are able to hijack human perception and certainly create screen memories so that you have strange, bizarre memories that are almost dreamlike after an abduction episode. And the abductees often you have to circumvent or break through the screen memories to get to the actual recollection of the event. And these virtual reality scenarios can be quite complex. It seems like we are very susceptible, human beings, of having our perception hijacked and distorted. And I wonder, and as I was listening to you describe Carl's case in the film, I wonder if what Carl recalls from that case is exactly what happened to him, or if he was perhaps subjected to some kind of perceptual manipulation, a virtual reality scenario. And I mean, I certainly, as it pertained to the face peeler stuff in Peru, I'm fairly certain that's nefarious humans in possession of advanced technology. If that's the case, because what I didn't mention was Talia says that she heard those individuals, those abductors speaking, and they were speaking. She referred to one as the gringo, and he was the taller one, and the other one as the Peruvian. And she called the gringo because he had a gringo accent when he was speaking Spanish. They were both speaking Spanish. Clearly, he had a very strong, thick gringo accent, and she was able to detect that. And so that seems to be very human. And if that's the case, if somebody is some human faction or group is in possession of that kind of advanced technology, again, we're not just talking about hoverboards, we're talking about advanced aerospace tech here in that case, then it's not a far stretch to wonder if that same group or something like that group is operating here in the United States and doing the same thing, but they're being much more conspicuous. Inconspicuous over here in the United States. You can abduct people in the Amazon among these indigenous tribes and do all kinds of experimentation, whatever. Nobody really pays that much attention to them, certainly not Americans, right? Because it's just these indigenous people living out in these remote villages. Over here in the United States, you have a lot more guys like you out there who are investigative and who are going to take notice to a phenomenon like this, especially if it's conspicuous, especially if it's not done in a way that is intentionally misleading. So I also think that could be in play here. You could have a nefarious human group in possession of advanced technology doing something who's responsible for at least some of these cases. And we know that in these areas where these people have gone missing, there's been a lot of UFO activity. I forget the name of the gentleman involved, but there's a particular case in your film where there's these guys who are out hunting, and one of them was in the trailer, the other one was taking a leak in the woods, and he's walking back to the trailer, and they saw, just, I think the guy says 80 feet above the trailer, a typical triangular craft with the three, lights on each corner and then that red light in the middle, which so many people have seen. I mean, this is very, very, one of the most common UFO sightings is exactly this triangular craft. And so there's definitely, I would say there definitely seems to be a connection between some of these missing person cases and advanced aerospace technology. Wouldn't you say that that's true?
I think some of them for sure. One of the things that we talk about all the time, just as a group, is you were talking about cattle mutilations before. So the National Institute of Discovery of Sciences was the team that was formed by Robert Bigelow to investigate cattle mutilations, Bigfoot, et cetera. And then they migrated to Skinwalker Ranch, spent 15 years there, and then they eventually turned it over to who's running it now. But they kind of ran out. The head of their investigative team is a guy named Colin Kelleher, and I know Colin really well. I've met with him many, many times. We talk about issues just like you and I are talking. And it was their belief that there were two different factions taking cattle. One apparently was extraterrestrial, and one was terrestrial. Could have been even our government. And he said, maybe, Dave, it's the same thing for your missing people. But one of the things that we talk about all the time that really bothers us is you think about the cattle. The cattle are taken away from where they lived, the ownership, the cattle ranch, and whatever is done to them is done to them. They're cut, blood's drained, etc. And then they're put back. They're dropped back. Many times when they're dropped, they have broken bones on one side of the animal. Same with humans. They're dropped back. But now the question is, if an extraterrestrial had that ability, what's the point in putting them back, right back where the owner could find them? Why is it important for the owner to find them? Why not put them back in the middle of the wilderness area or jettison them into space? Same with the human. Why put them back? What's that point? Is it to let them know that there's some controlled entity out there that we can do this to any of your cattle at any time? Or we can do this to any of your people at any time? Why not just get rid of them?
That's a very good question. Maybe they just don't care as it pertains to cattle. I mean, we're going to notice missing people. We're not going to send out a search party for a missing cow, with dogs and helicopters. And maybe they assume that the cattlemen are just going to think that there was predation involved or something like that. I don't know. It is a very, very good question. Why drop that cow? Why leave evidence of anything at all? Because cattle go missing all the time for lots of different reasons. Like you said, they could just drop it in a lake or something like that, or incinerate it. It is a very, very good question. And especially if there's a human component to cattle mutilations, why would certainly if you and I were running some kind of a secret operation, doing something with people's cattle, we would not drop the corpse there. We would dispose of that corpse in a way that there was no evidence. It would be very easy for us to do that if we had the technology to abduct that cow in the first place, like in the case of cattle mutilations. I can't think of any reason why we would drop the body there, drop the cadaver right where the farmer can find it, unless we're sending a message.
So I've had a lot of people at conferences walk up to me and say, Dave, and people are 100% convinced of this, that we're living in a simulation. And that act is meant for others running the simulation to watch how we respond to that, whether it's a human body or the cattle. And I've heard some people talk at conferences I've also spoke at about we're living in this simulation. Some of their arguments are pretty compelling.
The only thing that I wonder about that is, why not just do the same thing with the human abductions then, right? Why not just take them from places that are less inconspicuous and then work on them and then drop them back on the ground, like in the middle of a city, if the intent was a message? It seems to me that the missing persons thing, that somebody's definitely trying to make that look like, the person drowned in the river or died of hypothermia. Whereas the cattle mutilation, it seems like they don't care. They just take the cattle, do what they want with it, and then drop it. So I don't know. I mean, it's so mysterious. I mean, we could sit here and speculate endlessly about what the motivation might be and who might be doing it. If you've got a few more minutes, I'd like to fire off some questions at you I have a members community, the Alberino Analysis members community, and I always ask my members if they have questions that they would like to ask my guests. I'm going to fire a few of these at you if you've got a few more minutes. And I think you did answer this earlier, but maybe if you can just encapsulate it again. Ticey Flynn is asking, what made you become interested or how did you become involved in investigating unexplained missing person cases? And I think you did address that in the beginning, but if you could just give us a quick answer on that again.
I was at a national park investigating a peripheral issue. I noticed some national park rangers hanging around. They weren't making contact, just hanging around. Later on that night, off the park, they came over to the place I was staying at, knocked on the door. First, there was one. He came in, he told me that he had worked at a series of national parks. He noticed that there was some unusual things happening with missing people. For that first 7 to 10 days, there was a lot going on, and then there was nothing going on. They tried to get reports, they couldn't get them. And he said that he had a friend at this national park. They compared notes, and the notes were the same. Later on, his friend, who also a ranger, came and we kind of talked it out. And they said, somebody ought to be looking into this, Dave. And that's how it got started.
Wendy Branham is asking, and you did talk about this as well, but do you have a theory as to why many of these cases occurred at or near sources of water? So specifically, aside from making it look like a cover-up, like the person died, that's very convenient. You could drop them in the river or in the lake, and they drown, and that gives investigators a plausible explanation of how the person died. Do you have any other ideas of why that might be?
So if you follow the path of UFOs, then you need to also follow the path of USOs. And underwater submerged objects are something the Navy has reported for decades. And I think a portion of the public may not be aware of how prevalent it is, but orbs, UFOs, them going into water to hide is really something very easy for them. And I don't know if it's related, but I wouldn't be somebody that would ignore that or put it aside and poo-poo it. I think it's probable that they're related somehow.
I'll tell you a quick story here. I was in Peru a few years ago working on a film, and we were in the desert, and we were in the desert around Pisco, doing some work there, investigating certain things. And one of the things that we were doing was we were looking for Inca treasure, because the Inca would often take artifacts of gold and silver and throw them into bodies of water as an offering. And recently, a couple of years ago, they found a huge hoard of Inca artifacts in Lake Titicaca that were part of this kind of ritualistic activity. And so we were...
Titicaca's had a lot of USOs.
A lot. I interviewed quite a few people out there who've seen the craft coming out of the water. A lot. And it's very, very deep. That lake is a very mysterious place, very, very deep. Tons of UFO activity in the Puno area, where Lake Titicaca is. And in this particular case, we were working with this lake. It was a lake, small lake, not a big lake, bigger than a pond, but not a big lake. And it's in the middle of the desert. And it's one of the only bodies of water around, because this is serious desert out there. And I forget the name of the lake, but it was in a region called Moron. It's spelled like moron, but it's called Moron. And there's a little village nearby. I can't remember the name of the village, but we were out there with metal detectors around the lake. And then we have a state-of-the-art GPR unit that operates off of a drone platform. So we were flying our GPR unit around the lake, and this was part of the film, right? We're looking for Inca treasure in this particular segment of the film. And as we were operating around this lake, we had with us Chase Kletsky, who was one of the investigative directors over there at MUFON. And Chase is a good friend of mine. And Chase told me a story. She said last time she was there, because she had been in the area previous to this operation we were doing. And she told me this story where they were interfacing with the mayor of the town and some of the villagers from the town. And the mayor told her that there was an incident that happened at this little lake, again, in the middle of the desert, in which there was a flying saucer came over the lake, and it was not even very high. I think it was like 30 feet, 40 feet above the lake. It stationed itself above the lake, and it began to draw the water up from the lake into the craft. And this was seen by a bunch of people. And it was happening for an extended period of time. And the people around the lake started to freak out. They ran over to the village, and villagers came from the village to witness this, and the mayor came as well. And they're all standing there watching this saucer suck the water out of the lake. And they're freaking out, A, because it's a flying saucer, sucking water out of the lake, and B, this is one of their only sources of fresh water. And they need this lake. And so the villagers started to pick up rocks and throw it at the craft. And it was dinking off. I forget if Chase told me that the mayor told her that the rocks were dinking off of the craft or off of a force field around the craft, but they were dinking off of something. And so this is a really remarkable case where you have all these witnesses, and they're literally pegging this thing with rocks, trying to get it to go away because it's sucking their water up. And this is not an uncommon thing. As you rightly say, UFOs are often associated with bodies of water coming up out of the water, going down into the water. For whatever reason, especially if it's a deep body of water, there seems to be bases under there. They like to build their bases under the ground beneath the water. And it's very bizarre, but there is a very important connection here between these craft and water, liquid bodies of water, which is very mysterious. And, there could be a dozen reasons, different reasons why that might be the case, but it's a very good point. Finally, Mary Basler asks, would you personally, Dave, would you feel comfortable? Do you camp or hike in national parks with your wife or with your family? Or at this point, are you so disturbed by this that you stay away from national parks? How would you approach that? And do you have any recommendations for people who are camping and hiking in national parks or in wilderness areas with this missing persons thing in mind?
So for me, getting out in the wilderness, spending time, that's the reason I came to Montana. And I don't want to have a fear-based lifestyle. The number of people that go missing that fit our criteria is so minute that I would never let it affect myself. Now, if I had small kids, I think I would actually keep them on a leash. They would not get out of my sight. They would always be in front of me. But myself, yeah, I go all the time. That's my world. And yeah, no, I'd never.
I agree. Like I said, I live over here by Yellowstone. I spend a lot of time in the park and around the park. And as I said earlier, since I've been informed about your work, I've always had it in the back of my mind, especially when with my boys, with my family. But I think, people just need to have a high level of awareness. Anytime you go into the wilderness, obviously you need to be prepared. If you can have a GPS on you and a firearm and whatever. But I feel the same way. It doesn't hinder me from going out, and I go camping and backcountry and stuff like that, and hunting so Mary, just have a high level of awareness, but I wouldn't allow that fear to dominate you and to stop you from enjoying the outdoors. So, Dave, thanks so much for coming on and discussing this with me.
I appreciate you having me on. My YouTube channel is called the Can-Am, like Canadian American, Can-Am Missing Project. Got 700 videos there about missing people. I talk about trail site safety. I've done a lot of interviews just like you do. And there's like tons of content there. And one recommendation, do not ever buy my books from Amazon or eBay. You'll pay $50 to $100, $200 a piece. On our website, $25 a piece. Our website is NA, like North America, nabigfootsearch.com. Go to the online store to find them there.
Yeah, and definitely everybody check. If you haven't seen, I suspect many of you have already seen Dave's films, but they're phenomenal. So go watch his films, read his books, follow him on YouTube. And I look forward to seeing you over here in Bozeman, Montana for the conference in June. I think we're going to have a great time.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
And then I'll have to have you back on again to have a different conversation about Bigfoot, because I'm very, very interested in Bigfoot, and I know you've done deep research into that. So we'll have to have that Bigfoot discussion at another time. But thanks for joining me today. And I look forward to seeing you in person here in June.
Thanks a lot, Tim.